welcome. So we're going to end Michael's session, and then, all right, just give me a couple seconds here. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to go into our next session, which is called Democrat Disdain for Election Laws. Very pleased to introduce two speakers today. We have Colonel Shawn Smith. After serving for more than 25 years in active duty for the United States Air Force and maintaining positions of tremendous responsibility, Colonel Smith helps lead Cause of America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit establishment to help grassroots American citizens restore integrity and trust in our elections. A very worthwhile organization that Shawn is involved with now. And I'd like to welcome and thank Rachel Alexander. Rachel has been very helpful in putting this program together. She introduced me to wonderful speakers like Shawn Smith that we're going to hear from, and several of the other headline speakers that spoke to us today came through Rachel. Rachel Alexander is the editor of Intellectual Conservative. Rachel frequently appears on TV and news radio. She previously served as an assistant attorney general for the state of Arizona, corporate attorney for GoDaddy Software, and special assistant deputy county attorney for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So take them off of mute, and we will listen to Shawn Smith and Rachel Alexander in just a few seconds. Rachel, I might need you to help me. Oh, there you go. Okay, so I think we're ready. Shawn. Okay, so I think you're ready to go. Shawn, I think you were going to start off, so if you'd like to start, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, David. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Is that good? Okay, great. First of all, thank you for the invitation to speak to everyone. It's not something I ever wanted to do. But you know, my background with military, I spent pretty much my whole adult life until 2017 on active duty. Because of that, I was necessarily apolitical. You know, we don't want our officer corps to show any partisan leanings or activity whatsoever. It's essential to kind of, you know, civilian authority over the military. And I'm not an attorney, which will become immediately evident. But you know, the old saying that what do you call a fisherman who falls out of the boat? You're a swimmer. Well, I've gotten an education I did not want in our legal system, and particularly in lawfare with respect to election integrity over the last 4 years. I had no knowledge whatsoever about voting and election systems before 2020. I mean, I voted, you know, as a military member. It was usually absentee, and I just assumed, you know, I guess because I was an idiot, but I assumed, you know, mea culpa, innocently and naively, that things were going along swimmingly in our own federal and state governments, that there were people who were under oath there and they were taking care of the business of, you know, government the way that the military was taking care of the nation's business overseas and with respect to threats. And maybe that's a fair comparison, and we've missed some threats, but I knew nothing before November 2020 about election systems. I couldn't have named a single vendor. I couldn't have told you about the procedures, the statutes, nothing. And then I saw in November 2020, I saw just after voting in person, I saw a news report about turnout in Colorado, and I thought that didn't seem right. And I started researching, and I did a lot of research when I was on active duty. I was a RAND fellow for the Air Force at the RAND Corporation. I had a couple master's degrees that I obtained while I was on active duty, did theses for those, did a lot of research in various staff assignments, including up at Office of Secretary of Defense. So I'm not incapable there. And when I turned that sort of inherent curiosity and those skills onto the election systems and election environment, it just stood the hair on the back of my neck on end. So the first thing I did was see data in voter registration and turnout that seemed completely implausible to me. And I had some prior knowledge of sort of election development in other countries, because those were things that we looked at as we were doing either nation building or, you know, planning to dismantle nations when they were our adversaries. So I saw some things in Colorado's voter turnout data that did not look right in registration data. Then the real fun began because I'm not a cyber expert like somebody like Clay Parikh or Ben Cotton that recently testified down in Georgia, although I know a lot about the cyber threat, but I am an expert in testing. And when I started reading voting system manuals and test reports, I knew we were in real trouble. So anyway, I ended up accidentally being drugged into a mission I didn't want, doing election integrity research. And now after 4 years of that, of what I now think of and call citizenship, the way the framers intended it, the way I had neglected it, and I've come to some well-honed, informed conclusions about our elections and architecture, including about the way these laws and legal system are abused. So just as a preface, my perspective is election integrity is about civics, not parties, that the parties and some individuals and kind of seeking to win at all costs and by indulging systems, procedures that have promised short-term or short-sighted gains, our major parties have undermined election integrity. And I would say there's a significant difference in the parties, and this is how I would describe it. I can find Republican, Democrat, and independent and unaffiliated voters, citizens who are interested and passionate about election integrity. In fact, there's a guy here in Colorado who's been doing it for a couple decades. He's a lifelong Democrat. We disagree about everything except election integrity. And I found the spectrum also for Republican public officials and politicians and candidates that ranges from they won't say election fraud and will literally turn on their heel and walk away if you start trying to talk to them about it, to people who instead say, give me liberty or give me death. Let's out the truth and let the chips fall where they may. But I have not, and I've spoken to hundreds of public officials, I have not found a single Democrat public official candidate or politician who will stray from the narrative that 2016 was rigged by Russia and Trump, and 2020 was pure like baby's breath and Bill Gates' love of humanity. So, our Constitution's clear. We've instructed our government that we're entitled to a Republican form of government. Our government's delegated powers and authorities from the people for the purpose and to the extent that they protect and don't interfere with our natural, enumerated, implied, and necessary and inherent rights. And that doesn't require any necessary and proper interpretation. The Ninth Amendment is Madison's explicit statement that the enumeration of certain rights doesn't deny or disparage others retained by the people. And the 10th is explicit that powers that aren't delegated to the United States or prohibited to the states or reserved to the states or the people. Our state constitutions vary in their precise language, but they generally assert that their citizens are sovereign and that elections in each state must be free and equal and pure, guaranteeing the right of suffrage. But a problem that we're facing in the legal environment is a problem like mine where I was not paying attention to elections. And that is that our institutions, and you can see, once you hear it, you'll see it at work, even if you never realized it before. Our institutions deliberately and premeditatedly have narrowed the Overton window for Americans' framing of our own suffrage. So they describe the electoral franchise as us marking a piece of paper or touching a screen to indicate our preferences and then surrendering that paper or digital representation to public officials' hands or a mailbox or a drop box or a stranger who might or might not deliver it until that narrow Overton window is just whatever you do that gets you a sticker that says I voted. But that's not suffrage for sovereign people, right? We're entitled to a Republican form of government and free, equal, and pure elections. And our franchise is not just, it's the foundational right upon which the legitimacy of our government and its exercise of delegated power is based. And like all the authorities and powers that we talk about for government, it doesn't just include the enumerated aspect, but implied, resulting, and inherent. So in the Constitution, we're guaranteed Republican form of government. But that implies, necessarily includes the right to see all the basis and proof that an election result reflects an accurate tally of eligible voters' legitimate votes and no ineligible voters' input or illegitimate votes or inaccurate tallies. And that is where most of the lawfare is interfering with our franchise. So if you go back and look at the Wisconsin Supreme Court statement in their opinion in the Teagan v. Weck, Wisconsin Election Commission's case about unattended ballot drop boxes that the WEC deployed in 2020. They said if the right to vote is to have any meaning at all, then elections must be conducted according to the law. And they said throughout history, tyrants have claimed electoral victory via elections conducted in violation of governing law. But I want to add to that simple self-evident observation. Madison completed the principle in Federalist 53, writing as Publius, when he said, the important distinction so well understood in America between a constitution established by the people and unalterable by the government, and the law established by the government and alterable by the government, seems to have been little understood and less observed in any other country. I would argue we've lost sight of that distinction, particularly our public officers and officers of the court and judges, but our election officials from state on down. And there's very little, from what I've seen in these hundreds of cases, of application of the first principles with respect to election law or administrative code to consider whether those election laws or administrative are restricting the exercise of our constitutional rights as the sovereign in the country. So because of that narrowing of the Overton window, our state and federal government's conduct has been creating laws that circumscribe and restrict our full suffrage rights. It reminds me of George Carlin talking about trying to stump the priests at his Catholic school, where he's asking, Father, can God make a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it? Our legislatures should not be able to restrict our rights to full and unrestricted transparency in our elections, but that's exactly what they've done. And worse, it's been done in administrative ways. And I'll talk about a lot of those examples, an example of each type. And I also want to say, that has to stop. We have to stop it. And if we don't stop it, it'll be the death of our constitutional republic, because at this point, our election results are what they tell us they are, not what we can see for ourselves. So that perversion and abuse of law and of government power and authority comes in several forms in lawfare and dereliction of duty. And the first I will say is what I would call ignoring the law. So an example of this in the state of Colorado, the Secretary of State Griswold has prescribed, as she's required to prescribe procedures, but she's prescribed procedures for recounts of elections that have been used repeatedly for several years that ignore Colorado statutory requirements for manual comparison counts. So the statute said that you had to select, the canvassing board had to select a tabulator used in the election at random, and then you had to do a manual count of every ballot that was tabulated by that tabulator, and then compare that to the machine count from the election. And if they matched, or if they matched except for errors in the hand count, then you could then proceed with a machine count. Instead, what she prescribed was logic and accuracy tests as that comparison count. Those did not meet the statutory requirements. So this happened over and over again, naked violations of black letter law. Citizens called the Secretary of State out on her violation for law, so she and the General Assembly worked together to change the law. So now those recount procedures are no longer required to do a manual comparison count. They can just use logic and accuracy testing. And we see this happening all over the place. In Arizona, the 2022 election, Maricopa County, fourth largest county in the country, failed to conduct statutorily required logic and accuracy test of its tabulators. They falsely certified that they had done it, and then they illegally installed and used uncertified software on those tabulators. The results are, everybody's aware of. They had rampant failures. They were sabotage, not machine errors, at their vote centers, causing a lot of ballots, thousands, to be diverted to where they were hopefully scanned and tabulated at central count. We've concluded, I was helped with that analysis, we concluded that that was a deliberate objective of the sabotage of those tabulators. And yet no criminal referral, despite the fact they violated, again, black letter law in the state of Arizona. No action by any law enforcement authority. In Georgia, a member of the election board for Fulton County stated in a sworn affidavit that in 2020, Fulton County performed no signature verification on absentee by mail ballots in the 2020 election. In Michigan, in 2020, the state counted 300,000 more ballots than they had voters to attribute them to in their qualified voter file for the election. And in Michigan, the difference in that election in votes was only 154,000 votes. So almost double the total difference in the outcome was accounted for by just that one violation of law. There's another category, and those are, you know, all government acts, but that were supported by, petitioned for, and argued for by private organizations that are engaged in this lawfare to corrupt the landscape of election law, whether it's ignoring the election law or enacting election laws that, like the one where I described in Colorado, where they just get rid of this safeguard that they weren't observing in violation of the state law. By doing that, the Secretary of State and the General Assembly violate their responsibilities under the state constitution. And I've been mystified by this one because, like in Arizona, as another example, in Arizona, the statute requires that the county boards for elections, that they have all of their ballots printed and available for inspection 10 days before an election. But in order to use a vote center model where they can have anybody show up at any vote center and print a ballot for them on demand, they don't follow the state statute. And by doing that, the Secretary of State and the election commissions there and the state or county boards are violating the legislative prescription, and the legislature is allowing it. So again, they're violating their constitutional obligation. This has mystified me, like why within the legal community, there's this sort of idea that the Constitution was a foundation, but it's not to be applied or enforced. And I think that's at the root of a lot of our issues too. In fact, a lot of laws have been enacted by legislatures that violate the US or state constitutions, like responsibility or requirements to only allow citizens vote. So if you look in any state statutes, you're going to find almost every state, the states allow voter identification, which isn't identification at all. It can't be verified in any way by government officials. So you can use, in most states in the United States, for registration and voting, a completely photoless utility bill that the election officials can't verify as authentic. And so I have to ask, you know, well, what's the difference between that and an ID card with no photo that says, you know, McLovin, or literally in quotes, I'm whoever I say I am in the name field? 3 of our 5 largest states in the United States, California, New York, and Pennsylvania, require no identification at the polls as a state law. And California just prohibited that, just prohibited local governments from enacting any requirement to verify voter ID. So in California, you only have to present ID if you're a first-time voter, but they don't even have to do that now because of that law. And, you know, among the ID, they don't just allow, you know, like a utility bill or a canceled check or a passport. They allow literally any photo ID, where photo ID is even required or asked for, from a commercial establishment. When I first read that, I remember that when I lived in California, I grew up there, I used to go to this Malibu, you know, fun park, and they had a go-kart track, and they issued me a Roadrunner racing license, which when they, they left the gate open. I was 11. They left the gate open. They caught me about a mile away when the go-kart ran out of gas, and they asked me never to come back, but they did not take my Roadrunner racing license. According to state law in California, I could literally take that license and vote with it. There was no citizenship verification, no residence verification. It completely fails the constitutional standard of requiring that the states verify that only citizens are allowed to vote, and that only their residents are allowed to vote, and that only those 18 and older are allowed to vote. So those are, you know, profligate across the nation, these kind of violations that have been enacted by our legislatures with no pushback from citizens, and no pushback from the federal government, which is not particularly interested in integrity in elections. There's a category of lawfare and legal violations I would call or describe as distorting law, and acts by corrupt officials and institutions to restrict, citizens' right to the elective franchise, the full franchise. Among those are selective enforcement. I'm trying, by the way, deliberately to avoid all the just egregious cases with President Trump, because those have all been well publicized, but people may not have heard of all these others. So in Colorado, Clerk Tina Peters was just convicted and sentenced. Among the absurd counts that Clerk Peters was convicted of and sentenced for were violating the rules of the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State herself, and falls under selective enforcement, has repeatedly violated her own rules. And I know because I've provided sworn affidavits in accordance with our state law to the Secretary or to the Attorney General and to multiple district attorneys. And they have done nothing, even though the statute in Colorado requires them. It says, shall investigate forthwith, and they have refused. I could cite hundreds of counts of the Secretary of State in Colorado violating her own rules and state and federal statutes, destroying election records on thousands of Colorado voting system components, installing untested, uncertified software, falsely certifying voting system compliance with statutes and certification requirements, influencing public officials and servants to illegal acts, which is another charge that Clerk Peters was convicted of. So this is another one that you can find. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer and Kathy Bachbar violated statutes and rules left and right, just limitless, like stochastically unlimited. And yet there has been no enforcement against them, even when they are found in a civil court to have violated these laws or statutes or rules. They face no prosecution. And so there's a selective application, and that's one type of lawfare. There's also this phenomenon of novel application and interpretation. And of course, President Trump has suffered from this, but I'll give another one. It was just happened in the last week. In the Georgia case in DeKalb County GOP versus Secretary of State Raffensperger, the Secretary of State's attorneys, which are paid for by citizens, argued before that court that because the Election Assistance Commission and the Secretary of State in Georgia had certified the voting system without examination or testing by a competent cyber examiner, and it had no examination by a competent cyber examiner, because the test lab that tested it the director admitted in a federal court or in the court in Curlin that he had no cybersecurity expertise. So they failed to identify these dangerous, egregious vulnerabilities in the system, which did not comply with the certification standards, which would allow and risk fraudulent or inaccurate election results from the systems, that because the petitioners, the DeKalb County GOP, Marcy McCarthy, did not raise objections to the continued use of the voting system prior to the realization that the Georgia Secretary of State would not properly respond to those identified vulnerabilities after certification, that the vulnerabilities identified since that point by competent cyber examiners should be disregarded. This is the argument of the Secretary of State's attorney, so that the extraordinarily vulnerable and likely compromised voting system could be used without interruption in the most consequential election in the United States since 1864. And I swear, if you haven't watched the video, the state's attorney chuckled while she suggested this to the court. Another case, Colorado, NAACP, League of Women Voters, Mi Familia Vota versus Shawn Smith, Holly Kaysen, and Ash Epp and USCIP. I am that Shawn Smith, so I know a lot about this case. So this is three purportedly civil rights organizations that sued citizens, and a citizens group claimed that we were falsely claiming, by the way, making defamatory claims that we had targeted for intimidation minority voters because we were canvassing government voter roll and voter history information. They sought an injunction against citizen canvassing, even though all three of those organizations engage in canvassing themselves. They asserted a private right of enforcement of voting rights and KKK Act violations, despite the fact that they suffered no injury whatsoever. They presented no evidence that they had suffered any injury. They had no witnesses who claimed even to have spoken to much less been intimidated by the defendants until they got to a dismissal order risk, and then they had coached an affiant to allege, despite her lack of personal knowledge, that the unofficial, non-legal entity assembly of citizens, which was called USCIP, that we participated in, which had been dismissed by the court as a defendant because it didn't legally exist, was involved. So to make it clear, their only witness for the plaintiffs never identified a single one of the named defendants as having visited her or intimidating her. And in fact, on the bench or on the stand, she disavowed that we had ever visited her, spoken to her, or intimidated her. And the USCIP, which was again dismissed as a defendant because it didn't legally exist, she admitted she had no personal knowledge of the organization. And yet we still were taken to trial. The total costs for us as plaintiffs so far are approaching $500,000, as defendants, are approaching $500,000. Most defendants, most citizens would never come close to being able to withstand that kind of legal onslaught. They had Lathrop GPM, Free Speech for People. They had at one point 7 attorneys in the courtroom for the plaintiffs, all paid for out of the lawfare slush funds, like the money that comes out of North Fund, 1630 Fund, basically Soros Open Society's money that flows down through that series of nonprofits. So we went to trial with only their one witness who disavowed on the stand that we had ever been involved with her or engaged with her at all. The judge ruled in favor of the 3 defendants, stated in plain English that there was no evidence whatsoever of any intimidation or intent to intimidate by the defendants, nor targeting of minorities, that we had prevailed in the lawsuit, that we were entitled to repayment of our legal fees and costs by the plaintiffs. And now the plaintiffs have appealed and argued that we didn't prevail because our relationship with the plaintiffs, who never had an injury and therefore never had standing, hadn't changed. I want to point out that we found out about this lawsuit originally from the media calling to ask us questions, because the very first thing that the plaintiffs did after filing was push their claims with the sort of insulated by the fact that they were in their legal complaint, where they had smeared us as being associated with KKK Act violations, racism. They pushed that out to the AP wire. By the time we found out that we were defendants in the lawsuit, it had already been published by over 60 news outlets, including overseas. So there were literally people reading about us being associated with KKK Act violations in Tagalog before we found out that we were defendants. And the other important part about this is we were not the first target. There were at least 3 other citizens groups in other states who had been similarly targeted and which had consented to consent decrees because they had no ability to defend themselves. They didn't have the funds, and they didn't have the kind of extensive documentation of their intent and conduct that we had. So we defended our reputations and tried to stop them. But what they were trying to do, and you have to realize this is their objective, they wanted to silence us. They wanted to stop us from canvassing, even though they all engage in it. And why would they want to stop us from canvassing? Because by canvassing, we were finding anomalies in the voter rolls and voter history that could be associated with those organizations. They wanted to intimidate other citizens and not undertaking the same kind of canvassing, which is one of the only ways to confidently identify or verify the accuracy of voter rolls and history. And so this was not their first rodeo. And we're hoping it'll be their last, but they've got deep pockets, and we're waiting on determination on the appeal. So then there's another category called administrative, or you could call it administrative fiats outside legislative prescriptions. The Teagan v. Weck case is a good example where the Wisconsin Election Commission ignored that there were no unattended ballot drop boxes authorized by the legislature and deployed them in mass anyway. Of course, the Wisconsin Supreme Court found that those were unauthorized and unconstitutional because of that. But then because the guys like Robin Voss, and this is why I don't just say Democrats, the kind of handmaidens in the Republican Party have allowed this to continue because he opposed election integrity reforms in Wisconsin. They were able to overturn Supreme Court, and now that Teagan v. Weck ruling has been overturned, and they're deploying the unattended drop boxes again.
Okay, Shawn, thank you so much. If you don't mind, maybe we could take a break and get Rachel Alexander to speak a little bit, and then maybe both come back and maybe take a couple questions. So Rachel, I've already introduced you. Feel free to share your thoughts on election integrity issues.
So today, and for those of you who don't know me as well, I also was a former Maricopa County prosecutor and attorney for Maricopa County elections. And I can tell you today, I'm still friends on Facebook with a lot of those wonderful employees I used to work with back then when it was under better leadership. And the things that those employees, and I can't name them, they're private people, most of them are retired or in the private sector now, but they're just shocked at all the fraud and laws broken that they're seeing going on in their former office, where we all kind of thought of each other as family back then. So what I want to address in, my follow-up to Shawn's excellent, analysis of these election laws that are being broken is I just want to go over what I think the Democrats are going to break in this forthcoming election, and what they've already begun to show us in the primary, and already as early voting is about to begin. I believe it's begun in some states, and here in Arizona, they'll start sending out early ballots. I believe it's on October 9th, just a few days away. So what I wanted to say, regarding how it's already beginning is the non-citizens voting. You've got Elon Musk even posting constantly about the non-citizens voting, especially in Arizona and Maricopa County. We've got documented facts showing that there are over 35,000, and it continues to increase, people who have never provided documented proof of citizenship when they registered to vote. And so through a bunch of convoluted, twisted legal decisions, the courts are allowing them to cast federal-only ballots. And this alone could determine the difference between Trump winning in Arizona and Carrie Lake winning the Senate race in Arizona, because those are both federal races. Trump allegedly lost the presidential election in 2020 by a little over 10,000 votes. Kerry allegedly lost the governor's race in 2022 by a few more votes than that. And I've done, multiple articles showing how non-citizens, especially illegal immigrants, vote increasingly for Democrats. I think it's like at least 3/4 of them do. So that alone could, tip those two elections. And unfortunately, none of the challenges are going anywhere, because when the Democrats violate these election laws, their comrades in the judiciary rubber stamp them, and they come up with all kinds of clever ways to never hold them accountable for breaking these laws. And I'd like to just read you, I looked over the 92 election lawsuits from 2020. Some of you guys have seen my report, which I based on a report that came out of the wonderful John Droz's team of statistical PhDs going 92 cases. And here's the sneaky ways the judges get around finding that they broke the law. And in many cases, remember, these are criminal law breaking, lots of class 2 misdemeanors, even felonies. So basically standing, latches, filed too late, moot, no jurisdiction, too speculative and not redressable, would disenfranchise voters to do anything, failed to prove it would have changed the result of the election, which has never even been a legal standard. That one has been made up recently. failure to state a claim on which relief may be granted alleges no concrete harm. And then in addition, the evidence is ignored. The biggest ruse is that affidavits from witnesses and witness testimony doesn't count as evidence. But if you're a lawyer and you know the rules of evidence very well, witness testimony, such as affidavits, is one of the key pieces of evidence. There's huge sections on it in the rules of evidence, but the mainstream media and the lies, they don't understand the law, so they think that everybody believes them. The mainstream media thinks that nobody is even paying attention to that. So anyway, the judges will say that the affidavits are rife with generalization, so we can't allow them into evidence. They're full of speculation, hearsay, and a lack of evidentiary basis. Now, I want to point out that with these new laws that we suspect are going to be violated, even though there were a few good cases in those 92 election lawsuits, there were, of those 92, only 32 were decided on the merits, but 24 of those 32 were a victory for Trump and the Republican Party. So here's the problem. A sleazy judge, is going to say, well, that case was different. That was a different state. That was a different jurisdiction. The facts are slightly different. So that's how these judges are going to get away with ignoring, clear precedent from 2020. I want to point out this great line by legal expert Robert Barnes, one of the best constitutional attorneys. You should watch his podcast with Viva Free if you want some of the best legal analysis. Them along with Robert Gouveia are some of my favorites for legal analysis. He said, not ripe in spring, no standing by summer, lashes by fall, and moot by winter, to describe how the judges have treated the 2020 election cases. So moving on, I want to say that there were some really big smoking guns that we've actually already seen. And I'm just concerned that because the courts have blown off these huge examples of election fraud, widespread election fraud, which isn't even necessary in order to overturn election. That's just a made up standard the judges added in 2020. A couple of the honest judges from 2020, which I go over in my 92 cases, they even said fraud is almost impossible to prove. And by the time you actually find it, if you do, it will be too late. So he even clarified that's not even the standard, but it doesn't matter. The mainstream media won't ever report that. So some of these big cases included the smoking gun in the Georgia election in 2020, where election workers were caught bringing ballots out from underneath a table, that were ostensibly provided. Well, nobody can talk about it. Nobody reports on it because when Rudy Giuliani said that was fraud, he had a defamation lawsuit filed against him with a $148 million jury verdict that bankrupted him. And I'm not going to get into it because I'm not going to be one of the ones sued, but that's what's happening with our smoking guns. There was a smoking gun in Maricopa County here recently, where a Maricopa County temporary elections worker who had worked for several Democrats. He had worked on many progressive ballot initiatives, collecting signatures. This guy was a total operative. He got caught on video stealing a key fob from Maricopa County elections, and Bill Gates, Maricopa County Supervisor Bill Gates, who's a complete election fraud denier, he actually admitted during a press conference after the guy was caught and arrested that this key fob would have reprogrammed all 140 voting machine tabulators on election day in Maricopa County. So we see this happening. It's happening. That was a rare case where they actually caught it and stopped it, which gives me hope that maybe they'll catch it. But I mean, who knows? And so I want to point out so far the other example of what I believe is actual election fraud that's occurred this year in Arizona is in Pinal County. And you can go read my article about that, where wonderful Pinal County Supervisor Kevin Kavanaugh, who's an accountant and his wife is an accountant, they realized that the way the ballot dumps were coming in and being counted for the primary election didn't make any sense. because instead of having the results come in with certain percentages, like one candidate would get 33% of the vote, the other candidate would pull in 55% of the vote, and the numbers would just kind of interchange, right? For 6 races, I believe it was, unlike all the other races in Pinal County, the ballot dumps were always the same percentage. And so whatever candidate they wanted to win would have come in at, every ballot dump would be like 60%. And then every ballot dump for his opponent would be at like 30%. And it just kept going 60% to 30%. Next dump, 60% to 30%. Several dumps like that for all 6 candidates. So he's tried to do something about it. He's contacted law enforcement. He's now filed a civil lawsuit. The fact that nothing has happened yet, I'm not real hopeful. But I'm going to keep writing about that. And, there's not very many of us who have the guts to do it because, look what's happening. You talk about election fraud, you get prosecuted. So I'm just going to wrap up this with a list, and I hope to make count these up because it's astronomical, you guys, how many election laws they violated. So this is based on their prior behavior, mainly in 2020 and 2022. So leading up to Election Day, like early voting, here are the laws they violate, which the judges mostly have okayed, and they find these little technical excuses to say it's okay, they violated the law, even if it was criminal. So they will extend the voter registration deadline. They will have COVID types of last-minute emergency regulations relaxing election laws, like emergency voting centers. They will send unrequested absentee ballot request forms. They won't grant public records requests to investigate suspicious behavior. The bipartisan requirements for boards, observers, etc., they're going to be violated. They will fail to remove ineligible voters from the rolls. That's already occurring. There will be issues with the Postal Service, such as no chain of custody. We've already shown that here in Arizona, or the ballots coming in from USPS too late. There's going to be, the typical nursing home fraud where they're caught filling out ballots for people who are in memory care. And then there will be the dead people voting where we know they're looking to see who recently, died, and they go and vote a ballot in their name. And then on Election Day, we're going to see they will extend the deadline for voting. They will accept late ballots. They will keep polling locations open later if it benefits the Democrats. But if the Republicans need the polling places open later, like we did in 2022 with all the malfunctions of the equipment, the GOP asked for an extension. Of course, it was denied. Long lines, will be denied on Election Day because that would help Republicans who mostly vote on Election Day. There will be election observers predating ballots that came in too late to be counted. They will fix missing information on the ballots, missing postmarks. They will allow curing after the deadline for curing. There will be lax signature verification standards, such as no signature, other personal information missing. Verifying too quickly, like we had here in Maricopa County, verifying signatures in 1 second. In Arizona, and I've heard this is in other states as well, they won't compare the original voter signature on their voter registration to their voter ballot affidavit signature. There will be boxes of ballots that aren't sealed when they come to the main counting center. There will be ballots lacking chain of custody. That was a huge theme with like 300,000 ballots in Carrie Lake's lawsuit. She said, lacked chain of custody. And now her attorney, Brian Blum, has been suspended for even saying that. He gave a nice presentation earlier. There will be boxes of ballots found, primarily that all go for Democrats, all go for Harris. There will be ballots without creases or on different paper. The ones without creases, will be supposedly mail-in ballots, so they should have been creased. They won't allow observers in certain areas. The courts will say if it's not explicitly laid out in law, the recorders can deny the observers, which they'll do. So there'll be a block from observing canvassing and all kinds of different functions. There will be election board malfeasance. There will be, there could definitely be an incident causing long lines on election day, like we saw with the voting machine tabulators. And the last couple I got here are, there could be an incident at the Central Tabulation Center here in Maricopa County, it's McTech, causing the observers to leave, like, the leaky toilet at State Farm Arena in Georgia. And finally, all kinds of problems with the voting machines, whether lacking certification, connecting to the internet when they're not legally allowed to, switching votes, duplicate votes, adding fictitious votes, and they will get their own expert to say that there was nothing wrong with the machines. So that's pretty much it. I think we're out of time, so I won't continue anymore.
Well, you both made excellent eye-opening presentations, a little bit bleak, so maybe we can end the session on a little bit less of a bleak note. And Shawn, you can take yourself off of mute if you'd like to come back in. Do you think that some of the cheaters will be discouraged by Laura Trump, the head of the RNC, saying that we have hundreds of thousands of observers and thousands of lawyers, and if we win, anybody who cheats will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law? Do you think that will dissuade some of the cheating? And then the second question is, at what point does a lot of cheating not matter? If Trump gets 62% of the popular vote, will it mean that no amount of cheating is gonna help Harris or take the Oval Office?
Rachel, you want him?
I'll definitely take the first one. Okay. So basically, whenever they say, oh, we've got thousands of attorneys, we're way more prepared this year, I just say, well, you know what? They've got thousands of judges who are just going to throw all those attorneys' lawsuits out of court. And, I can tell you, I used to represent Maricopa County Superior Court judges when I was an assistant attorney general for Arizona. So I know how they operate. And I just came out with a review of all these judges, in Arizona who are up for retention election. And I can tell you, these guys, they ain't Republicans. A lot of them just switched their voter registration to Republican right before the Governor Ducey or Governor Brewer appointed them. And then one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that when, they try to tell you, oh, judges are just randomly assigned cases. It's just random that they get assigned to these judge cases. We have like a lottery system or whatever. That is the biggest line of bull. The presiding judge knows which judge gets assigned to each case. And so they can pretend till they're blue in the face, but we all know it's a lie. It's not true. And they are deliberately picking the most election fraud denying judges that they can. If you go over to my list of judges, I go over all their decisions, all their election fraud and versus election integrity decisions, and it is the absolute worst judges that are getting assigned to these cases.
What is the saying? Justice deferred is justice denied. The time frame in which citizens and counsel can bring the cases, get to hearings, get to evidence, there's just endless obstruction from the government itself with no recognition or reprisal from courts against those obstructing. And so that in some sense, the justice itself could be moot. Even if you were to win, the damage is already done. It's like, what did Lance Armstrong win? 7 consecutive Tour de France victories. And it was 5 years after his last victory where he finally admitted that he had been doping the whole time. What was the recourse or justice for the cyclists who he had taken those things from? And that's just sport, right? That's just money. That's just trophies, advertising, whatever. You want to see the effect of a failure to enforce our constitutional election law? Look at the southern border, North Carolina and Tennessee. They right now in this environment, it is the absolute power that corrupts, and you can see the effect of it. So I have no confidence in whatever claims the RNC's made because they have completely failed to engage in the most important election integrity fights over the course of the last 4 years. In fact, have frustrated the efforts of citizens. And so, if they do it, I'll be so grateful. I'll be so shocked, but I'll be so grateful.
Well, Okay, thank you both for speaking to us. You really enlightened us and shared a lot of good data points and introduced us to a lot of the shenanigans and malfeasance the Democrats perpetrate on the election system and on the country. Even though, academically, logically, you might be right and all that, but I want to leave the listeners with a more upbeat message. You still got to fight. The country is worth fighting for. Your future is worth fighting for. Your children's futures are worth fighting for. This might be the last chance to preserve our form of democracy, and do what you can. There's only another month. At least make sure you vote. Get your friends to vote. Educate them. You can send them this program. A lot of our speakers have their own podcasts and blogs and radio stations and X accounts and so forth. Get some good information. Another fellow, produces movies that make it easier to digest all this information. Do what you can to educate your colleagues. If you have time, be an election observer. Do what you can. Do what you can to preserve democracy.
Hey, David, can
Yes.
I turn that into a positive note?
Yes.
So I just wanted to say that, yes, everyone's kind of skeptical, emphasizing the ballot chasing operation over fighting election fraud. Is it really going to work? Is it a bad strategy? Well, I've always said we need to do both. And I will point out in that Pinal County primary, which I discussed earlier, where there was fraud and they tried to influence 6 different races. In one of the races, the Pinal County attorney race, which Brad Miller ended up winning, they tried to defeat him using fraud, but they didn't realize that he was going to bring in so many votes that they miscalculated. So it is possible. It happened here earlier this year, I believe.
Okay. Well, that's
I think that was 2016 too. I would tell everybody there's no citizenship happening on your couch. Get up and get involved right now. Don't just vote. Get involved. Demand accountability and transparency from your public officials, because that election belongs to you, and they had better understand it. Sooner or later, they had better understand it.
Great. Well, we all have to finish listening to this program, and then we have to get out and fight. So anyway, thank you both, Shawn Smith and Rachel Alexander. Really appreciate your contributions to the program. So we'll take a break. We only have about 9 minutes or so for our break. But let's stretch our legs a little bit and come back in a few minutes, and we have a few more sessions to go. Thank you.